Back in 1984, a wave of truly brutal violence swept across India, specifically targeting the Sikh community. It's a really significant and tragic chapter in the country's modern history. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through what happened, how it all went down, and why, even today, it remains so incredibly controversial.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have to talk about the words people use. Was this a riot? A chaotic, spontaneous explosion of anger? Or was it something much, much darker? You'll see human rights groups and survivors use far stronger terms like pogrom or even genocide. And that's because they argue the evidence doesn't point to random chaos, but to a planned, systematic attack. And that difference, believe me, is at the absolute heart of the story.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we're going to look at the event that came right before, the one that set the stage. Then, we'll talk about the assassination that really lit the fuse. After that, we'll cover the 4 days of violence itself. And finally, we'll get into the decades-long search for justice that followed.
All right, let's dive into part one, setting the stage. To really understand the explosion of violence that happened in November of 1984, we have to rewind a few months because, things like this don't just happen in a vacuum. Tensions were already dangerously high.
The flashpoint, the event that really kicked things off, was something called Operation Blue Star. This was a hugely controversial military operation ordered by the Prime Minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, in June of 1984, and it had massive consequences.
And this is where things get incredibly sensitive and painful. The official objective was to remove armed Sikh militants who were holed up inside the Golden Temple complex. But the location, the Harmandir Sahib, this is literally the holiest, most sacred site in all of Sikhism. So when the operation resulted in a huge number of casualties and caused major damage to sacred buildings, well, for Sikhs all over the world, it felt like a direct attack on their faith, on their very identity.
Just look at this timeline. It is incredibly tight. Operation Blue Star happens in June. Just 4 months later, on October 31st, the Prime Minister is assassinated. And then, bam, the very next day, on November 1st, the widespread violence begins. The speed of it all is just staggering.
So, all that anger and grief from Operation Blue Star, well, it boiled over and directly led to the single event that would act as the catalyst for everything that came next.
Yeah, the connection is crystal clear. On October 31st, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was killed by 2 of her own bodyguards, who were Sikh, and their motive was explicitly stated. It was retaliation for Operation Blue Star. This one single act of violence would unleash an absolutely devastating chain reaction.
And that assassination, that was the spark that lit the fuse. Now we get to the most harrowing part of this story, the 4 days of brutal, organized violence that immediately followed.
It wasn't days later. We're talking hours after the assassination. Organized mobs started pouring into the streets, and they had a very specific target, the Sikh community. While the violence happened in a few cities, the absolute epicenter was the nation's capital, Delhi. That's where it was most concentrated and most brutal.
And the way these attacks were carried out, it's just horrific. Mobs systematically hunted down Sikh men, pulling them from their homes, from their cars, and in many cases burning them alive. Their homes, their businesses, even their temples, the gurdwaras, were looted and burned. And this is a point you absolutely have to understand. There are countless eyewitness accounts saying the police just stood by and watched, or in some cases, even helped the attackers.
So this brings us right back to where we started, right? That question of what to call this. When you look at the systematic, targeted nature of the violence, and you hear this chilling accounts of police just letting it happen, the word riot just doesn't seem to fit for a lot of people. The evidence really points towards an organized pogrom, a planned attack on a specific community.
Okay, so after 4 days, the physical violence on the streets, it stops. But for the survivors, the nightmare was far from over. In fact, a whole new chapter was just beginning, the decades-long fight for justice and accountability.
The sheer human cost it's hard to even wrap your head around, and the numbers are heavily disputed. The official government figure for the number of Sikhs killed is around 3,350, but independent investigators and human rights groups, they say the real number is much, much higher, somewhere between 8,000 and 17,000. That gap, that massive gap alone, tells you a huge part of the story.
And just to give you a sense of how intense this was, think about this. Even with the lower official government number, more than 2,700 of those deaths happened in Delhi alone. The violence in the capital was just on another level.
The road to any kind of justice has been just incredibly long and frustrating. Right after the violence, Thousands of families were displaced, forced into relief camps. The government set up one commission after another to investigate. But for decades, nothing really happened. Prosecuting anyone powerful felt impossible. It literally took years, even decades, before some of the key political figures accused of organizing the violence were finally convicted.
When you put it all together, it's clear that the events of 1984 left a scar on India, a really deep and painful one that, for many, hasn't fully healed. It's still one of the most painful and controversial episodes in the country's modern history.
And all of this leaves us with a really big, difficult question. One that's not just about this specific event, but about history in general. After all the pain, after decades of commissions and delayed justice, what does full accountability for historical atrocity like this even look like? Is it even possible to achieve?